In the spring of 1607, 3 small wooden ships, worn from weeks at sea, drifted into a wide, quiet bay along the eastern edge of a vast continent. The men aboard were exhausted, hungry, and unsure if they'd survive another week. They came from a crowded island across the ocean, chasing rumors of gold, glory, and new lands to claim for their king. To them, this place was empty, wild, and waiting, but they were wrong. Long before those ships appeared, people had lived here, generation after generation, for thousands of years. They knew every bend in the river, every berry that ripened in summer, every deer trail through the forest. They built villages near the water, grew corn, beans, and squash in careful patterns, and honored the land with songs and ceremonies. They called their home Tsenakamaka. To them, the world was alive, not something to be owned, but something to live with. When the strangers first stepped onto the shore, the local people watched from a distance. These newcomers looked strange. Pale skin, stiff clothes, beards, and eyes full of fear and greed. They moved clumsily through the woods, tripping over roots, drinking from dirty streams, and failing to catch fish or hunt game. Within weeks, many of them were sick. Some died and were buried in shallow graves near their rough wooden fort. To the people who already lived there, these strangers seemed fragile, almost helpless. They didn't understand the seasons, couldn't read the sky for rain, and didn't know which plants healed and which poisoned. It was clear they wouldn't last long. Nature had a way of sorting out those who didn't belong. Others had come before, Spanish explorers decades earlier, and vanished just as quickly. So at first, the locals kept their distance, watching, waiting, wondering if these new arrivals would fade away like mist in the morning sun. But something was different this time. These strangers didn't leave. Even as their numbers shrank from hunger and disease, they kept building, digging, and clinging to the land like barnacles on a rock. And though they seemed weak, they carried things the locals had never seen. Metal tools that never dulled, cloth that didn't tear, and long tubes that roared like thunder and spat fire. They called them muskets. The sound alone was enough to send birds scattering from the trees. Still, the real danger wasn't in the weapons. It was in what the strangers didn't know they carried. Hidden in their breath, on their clothes, and the sweat on their skin were tiny invaders no one could see. Viruses and bacteria from a world far away. The local people had never been exposed to these sicknesses. Their bodies had no defense. It would be years before the full wave of disease hit, but the seeds were already planted. At first, curiosity won out over caution. A few brave souls approached the fort, offering corn in exchange for shiny beads or bits of copper. The strangers, desperate for food, accepted eagerly. One of their leaders, a sharp-eyed man with a quick temper, learned a few words of the local tongue and began trading, sometimes fairly, sometimes not. He made promises, drew maps, and claimed friendship. But trust was thin, like ice on a warm pond. The local leaders were wise. They'd seen outsiders before. They knew kindness could hide hunger, and words could mask plans. Still, they offered help, not out of weakness, but because their way taught that sharing kept the balance. To refuse aid to someone starving went against everything they believed. So they gave corn. They showed how to plant crops in mounds so the roots wouldn't rot. They pointed to the stars and explained when the fish would run, but the more the strangers took, the more they wanted. What began as survival turned into ambition. They didn't just want to live, they wanted to own. They marked trees, drew lines in the dirt, and spoke of claiming land as if it were a piece of cloth you could fold and carry home. This idea made no sense to the people who had always belonged to the land, not the other way around. As summer turned to fall, the strangers grew stronger. Their fort expanded. More ships arrived, bringing more men, more guns, and more hunger. For land, for control, for something they couldn't name but felt they deserved. The locals began to whisper among themselves, "These are not like the others. They do not leave. They do not learn. They take and take and take." Yet no one could have guessed what was coming. No one imagined that these stumbling, sickly men would become the beginning of something much larger, something that would reshape the world. At that moment, standing on the banks of the river, watching smoke rise from the fort, the people of Tsenakamaka still believed they held the upper hand. After all, the land was theirs. The seasons answered to them. The spirits walked with them. What they didn't know, what no one could have known, was that these pale strangers weren't just lost travelers. They were the first wave of something relentless. Something that had survived famines, plagues, and wars across an ocean. Something that saw the world not as a web of life, but as a battlefield to be won. And soon the true nature of these newcomers would show itself. Not in their weakness, but in their will to survive at any cost. They weren't just visitors. They were survivors of a harsh world of their own. And in their own way, they too were Deathworlders, forged in centuries of struggle, ready to fight, adapt, and endure, no matter who stood in their way. But that truth hadn't revealed itself yet. For now, it was still just a tense piece. A fragile dance between two worlds that barely understood each other. One thought the other would disappear. The other didn't yet know how deeply it would have to dig its roots to stay. And so, in the quiet forests of Virginia, the first act of a long, painful story began, not with a battle, but with a shared meal, a traded bead, and a question hanging in the air like morning fog. Who are you really? Winter came hard that year. The wind cut through the trees like a blade, and the rivers froze at the edges. Inside the rough wooden fort, the strangers huddled together, wrapped in thin blankets, their breath fogging the cold air. Food was almost gone. The corn they'd traded for in the fall had run out weeks ago. Hunting had failed. Most of the men didn't know how to track deer in snow, and their guns often misfired in the damp cold. Some tried to fish through holes in the ice but pulled up nothing but empty hooks. Outside the fort, life went on as it always had. In the villages along the river, families gathered around fires, sharing stories and warm meals. They stored dried corn, smoked fish, and nuts in woven baskets buried in the ground, food saved for exactly this kind of season. They knew how to live with winter, not against it. To them, the stranger's suffering wasn't cruelty, it was just the natural order. If you didn't prepare, you paid the price. But then something unexpected happened. A group of local people, led by elders who remembered the value of mercy, brought baskets of corn to the fort. They didn't speak much. They simply left the food at the gate and walked away. It wasn't a gift of friendship, it was an act of balance. In their worldview, letting others starve when you had enough disturbed the harmony of the world. So they gave, not because they trusted, but because it was right. The strangers, weak and desperate, took the food without question. They devoured it, cooked it, stored what little was left. For a few weeks they survived. But survival changed them. It gave them time to think, to plan, to grow stronger, and with strength came a new kind of arrogance. They began to believe the land owed them a second chance, that their survival was proof they were meant to be here. They started venturing farther from the fort, not just to hunt, but to explore. They walked through forests that had never heard their language, past burial mounds older than their own country, and into fields where crops had grown for centuries. They saw how well the villages were kept, how orderly the gardens were, how clean the paths, and instead of admiration, some felt envy, and worse, entitlement. If they can live so well here, they whispered, imagine what we could do with this place. Back home, their world was crowded, ruled by kings and priests, where land was owned by the few and worked by the many.
Here the land seemed endless.
No fences, no lords, just trees, rivers, and open sky. To them it looked empty, free for the taking. They didn't understand that ownership wasn't written in deeds but carried in memory, in song, in the way a grandmother taught her grandchild which root cured fever. As spring returned, the strangers planted their own crops, not corn, beans, and squash in the old way, but wheat and barley, seeds from across the sea. Most of it failed. The soil was different. The rains came at strange times, but they kept trying, stubborn as mules. And slowly they learned, not from books, but by watching. They noticed how the locals planted corn with fish buried beneath. It fed the soil. They saw how certain plants grew better together. Without saying thank you, they copied what worked. Their leader, the one who'd learned a few words, began visiting villages more often. He smiled more, offered more trinkets, and spoke of peace. But his eyes watched everything. Where the best fishing spots were, which paths led deep into the woods, how many warriors each village had. He wasn't just making friends. He was mapping weakness. The local people weren't fooled. They'd seen this dance before. Kind words today, sharp blades tomorrow. So they played along carefully. They traded but never gave too much. They shared knowledge but held back the deepest secrets. The sacred places, the true names of the rivers, the songs that called the rain. They knew that once something was given away, it might never come back. Still, the strangers kept growing in number. More ships arrived every year, not just with men, but with women and children now, signs they meant to stay. They built bigger houses, cleared more trees, and let their animals roam free, trampling gardens and fouling streams. The balance was tipping, and then came the sickness. It started quietly. A cough in one village, then fever, then whole families too weak to rise. The strangers didn't bring it on purpose. They didn't even know they carried it. But their bodies, hardened by generations of plague and war in crowded cities, held germs that were new to this land. To the local people, these diseases were like invisible storms. There was no cure, no warning. Children died in their mothers' arms. Elders who held the stories of the tribe vanished in weeks. The strangers watched it happen and did nothing. Some even saw it as a sign from their god that this land was meant for them. The heathens are being cleared away, they said, to make room for the righteous. They didn't mourn. They moved into empty villages, took tools left behind, burned homes to make space for their own. This was the real turning point. Not the guns, not the forts, but the silence that followed the coughing, the empty trails, the fields gone wild. The strangers began to realize they didn't need to fight as hard as they thought. The land was emptying itself for them. But the people who remained, they saw the truth clearly now. These weren't just lost men. They were something else, something that brought death without lifting a sword, something that grew stronger while others faded, something that didn't just survive hardship, but seemed to feed on it. And that's when fear turned to resolve. If these strangers wouldn't leave and couldn't be trusted, then they would have to be stopped, not with kindness but with wisdom. Not with rage but with strategy. The elders gathered in secret. They sent runners to distant villages. They remembered old alliances. They prepared, because they finally understood. The pale strangers weren't fragile. They were dangerous in a way no one had seen before. They didn't just take land, they took life itself quietly, slowly, without even knowing they were doing it. And if no one stood against them, there would be nothing left but silence where songs once lived. So while the strangers celebrated their growing fields and new homes, thinking they'd won by simply staying alive, the real resistance was just beginning. Not with fire or fury, but with memory, with unity, and with the quiet strength of people who refused to disappear. By the time the third summer rolled around, the strangers weren't just surviving, they were changing. The ones who'd once stumbled through the woods like lost children now moved with purpose. They'd learned which berries wouldn't kill them, how to set traps for rabbits, and when the fish swam upstream. They still didn't understand the land the way the people who belonged here did, but they were no longer helpless. And that made them far more dangerous. What shocked the local communities wasn't just their growing numbers, it was how they fought. In the old ways, conflict had rules. You fought warriors, not women or children. You struck to settle a wrong, not to wipe out a whole village. You honored the dead. But these strangers? They played by no such rules. When food ran low one winter, they didn't just ask for help. They raided nearby villages in the dead of night, burning corn stores, stealing tools, and driving families into the freezing woods. When a local leader refused to trade more than he could spare, they took him hostage, demanding ransom in food and furs. It wasn't war as anyone knew it. It was something colder, sharper, like a storm with no end. And behind it all was a hunger that went deeper than stomachs. These strangers didn't just want to live here. They wanted to own it. Every tree, every stream, every stone. They marked boundaries with sticks and ropes as if the earth cared about lines drawn by men. They spoke of civilizing the wild, as if the forests and rivers were broken things needing fixing. But the real surprise came not from their weapons or their walls. It came from how they kept going, no matter what. Lose 10 men to fever. They sent for 20 more across the sea. Have a crop fail. They'd take someone else's. Get pushed back in a fight. They'd return with twice the men and more guns. They didn't seem to feel the weight of loss the way others did. Grief didn't slow them. Shame didn't stop them. They just kept coming like waves against a cliff, wearing it down grain by grain. The elders began to talk in hushed tones about what kind of people these were. Not foolish travelers, not even ordinary invaders. These were survivors of something harsh, people shaped by lands where life was cheap and mercy rare. They carried that hardness in their bones. They saw the world as something to be bent, broken, and remade in their image. and that made them unlike any enemy the local people had ever faced. Still, not all hope was lost. The villages began to share more than just food. They shared warnings, plans, and memories. Young men trained harder. Women taught children secret paths through the swamps. Runners carried messages hidden in bundles of herbs. A quiet network grew, strong but unseen, like roots beneath the soil. Then came the tobacco. At first, the strangers grew it as just another crop. But soon they realized something strange. Back across the ocean, people would pay almost anything for it. Suddenly, their whole purpose shifted. They didn't just need land to live on. They needed vast fields to plant this green leaf that brought gold. And for that, they needed workers. When their own men refused to do the backbreaking labor, they turned elsewhere. First to desperate poor from their own lands, then, later, to people stolen from faraway shores. But that was still years off. For now, their greed focused on the land itself. They cleared forests that had stood for centuries. They dug ditches that changed the flow of rivers. They let their pigs root through sacred burial grounds, trampling bones and offerings without a second thought. To them it was progress. To the people who had honored those places for generations, it was desecration. Yet even as the strangers grew bolder, they made mistakes. They argued among themselves. Some wanted peace for trade. Others wanted only conquest. Their leaders changed often, sometimes by vote, sometimes by violence. This chaos gave the local people small windows of chance. A truce here, a delayed attack there, time to prepare. And prepare they did. They studied the strangers' routines, the times they left the fort to hunt when their guards changed, how they stored their gunpowder, always in a dry hut near the gate. They noticed how the strangers trusted their metal tools more than their own eyes, how they panicked when their guns got wet, how they never traveled without noise. Most importantly, they realized something the strangers never saw coming, that the land itself could be an ally. Swamps could swallow men whole. Rivers could flood without warning. Poisonous plants looked like food to the untrained eye, and if you knew how to move like a shadow, you could be 10 steps away and still unseen. So they waited. Not out of fear, but out of patience. They knew the strangers thought they were winning. Let them believe it. Pride makes people careless. What the strangers didn't understand was that resilience isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the mother who hides her child in a hollow log during a raid. Sometimes it's the elder who memorizes every star path, so his people can flee in silence. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to keep singing the old songs even when no one else is listening. And deep down, the strangers were still fragile. Their bodies still got sick. Their crops still failed. Their hearts still broke when letters from home never came. They wore armor, but inside they were just men. Afraid, tired, far from everything they knew. But they had one thing the local people couldn't match: endless backup. Every year more ships came. More hungry mouths, more hands ready to swing an axe or pull a trigger. The scale was tipping slowly but surely. Still, the people of the land refused to see themselves as victims. They were protectors, guardians. And they knew something the strangers had forgotten, that true strength isn't in how much you take, but in how much you're willing to give to keep your home alive. So while the strangers celebrated their growing fields and rising walls, the real battle was being fought in whispers, in footprints erased by wind, in the steady hands of those who refused to let their world disappear without a fight. They weren't just defending land. They were defending a way of life, one that saw the earth not as property but as family. And that kind of love, it doesn't die easy. The year 1622 began like any other. Cold winds giving way to soft spring rains, birds returning to the trees, and the first green shoots pushing through the dark soil. But beneath the calm surface, tension had been building for years, like a bowstring pulled tighter and tighter. The strangers had grown too bold. Their forts had become towns. Their farms stretched farther than anyone could walk in a day. They took more than they gave, spoke less, and demanded more, and treated the land like a thing to be used up and thrown away. The people who had lived here since time began could see the change in everything. The silence where deer once roamed, the muddy water where clear streams used to run, the empty spaces where villages once stood. And they knew, if nothing changed, there would be nothing left to protect. So the decision was made, not in anger, but in sorrow. Not for revenge, but for survival. A plan began to form quietly, carefully across dozens of villages. It wasn't just one leader's idea, it was a shared understanding, passed from elder to elder, runner to runner, carried in the rustle of leaves and the beat of distant drums. They would strike not as scattered groups, but as one body, one breath, one will. They chose a day when the strangers would least expect it, when the fields were being planted, when guards were relaxed, when trust had grown thin but still existed. They studied routines for months. They knew which gates were left open at midday, which men walked alone to check traps, which families lived farthest from the main fort and would be slow to get help. And then, on a quiet morning in March, it happened. At sunrise, small groups moved like mist through the trees. They didn't come with war cries or drums, just silence and purpose. In one settlement, they arrived offering baskets of corn, just as they had done for years. The strangers used to trade opened their doors without suspicion. In another, young men joined work crews pretending to help clear land, until the moment came. In village after village, the attack was swift, precise, and over before panic could spread. Nearly a third of the stranger population, men, women, even children, were gone in a single day. Homes burned. Tools were destroyed. Crops trampled. It wasn't cruelty, it was strategy. They weren't trying to kill every last person. They were sending a message: leave, or this will happen again. For a moment, it worked. The survivors fled to the main fort terrified, confused, whispering that the savages had turned on them without warning. But the truth was, the warning had been there for years, in broken promises, stolen land, and silent graves left by sickness the strangers brought with them. Yet what happened next shocked even those who planned the strike. Instead of retreating across the sea, the strangers doubled down. Their fear turned into fury, and their fury into something colder: resolve. They didn't see the attack as a desperate act of defense. They saw it as proof that the local people were dangerous, ungrateful, and needed to be controlled. And so they changed their rules: no more trading, no more truces. From now on, it was war, not just against warriors, but against everything that made life possible. They burned cornfields before harvest. They poisoned wells, not with poison, but by throwing dead animals into them. They captured people and forced them to work or held them as bargaining chips. When villages were found empty, they burned them anyway, just to make sure nothing could grow back. Worst of all, they stopped seeing the people as human. In their letters home, in their prayers, in their laws, they called them beasts, heathens, children of the devil. It was easier that way. Easier to destroy what you refused to understand. But the local people didn't break. They scattered, yes, but not in defeat. They moved deeper into the forests, into swamps and hills the strangers feared to enter. They rebuilt in hidden places. They taught their children the old ways in whispers. They kept the songs alive even when singing out loud could bring soldiers to their door. And they learned something new, that the strangers' strength was also their weakness. They depended on ships from across the ocean for gunpowder, tools, even seeds. They couldn't survive alone, so the people began targeting supply lines, ambushing small boats, cutting trails, making travel dangerous. They turned the land itself into a weapon just as they always had. Still, the cost was heavy. Every raid meant lives lost. Every burned field meant hunger later. Every child hidden in the woods meant a future lived in fear. But they held on, not because they wanted to fight forever, but because they believed their children deserved to know the taste of clean river water, the sound of cranes at dawn, the feel of soil that remembered their ancestors. Back in the fort, the strangers told themselves they were bringing order, civilization, God's will. But in their hearts, many knew it wasn't that simple. Some had married into local families. Some had learned to love the land the way it was. But those voices were drowned out by the louder ones, the ones who saw only profit, power, and progress. Years passed. The forests shrank. The rivers grew noisy with mills and boats. New strangers arrived, not just from the first island, but from others, all hungry for their piece of the new world. The balance that once held everything together, the respect for seasons, for spirits, for limits, was crumbling. Yet in the quiet places, life persisted. A grandmother teaching her granddaughter which route eases pain. A boy learning to carve a canoe from a single log. A fire kept burning through the night, not for warmth alone, but as a signal. We are still here. The strangers thought they had won when they built their last fort, when they drew their final map, when they declared the land settled. But they didn't understand that some things can't be conquered, only outlasted. And the people? They weren't waiting for victory. They were practicing survival as an act of love. Every seed saved, every story told, every prayer whispered to the wind was a quiet rebellion. They knew the road ahead would be long, dark, and full of loss. But they also knew this. As long as one person remembered the old ways, the world wasn't truly lost, because sometimes the strongest warriors aren't the ones with the loudest shouts, but the ones who keep walking even when no one is watching. Time moved on, as it always does. Seasons turned. Children grew. Trees that had once stood tall were cut down, and in their place rose fences, roads, and houses with chimneys that smoked day and night. The strangers, who were strangers no longer, now called themselves settlers, then citizens, then Americans. They built schools, wrote laws, and told stories about how they tamed the wild land. In those stories, the people who had lived here for thousands of years were either gone, forgotten, or painted as ghosts of the past. But the truth was quieter, deeper, and far more stubborn. In hidden corners of the same land, down winding dirt paths, behind thick pines along quiet riverbanks, families still gathered. They still planted corn in mounds just like their grandparents had taught them. They still knew which plants healed a cough, which roots brought strength, and which songs called the rain. They spoke their language in low voices at night, not because they were ashamed, but because they knew words are precious when the world tries to erase them. The great confederacy that once stretched across rivers and forests was broken into pieces, scattered, renamed, pushed onto smaller and smaller patches of earth. Treaties were signed and broken. Promises were made and forgotten. Children were taken to schools far away, told to speak only English, wear only certain clothes, and forget where they came from. For a time, it seemed like the old ways might vanish like morning mist, but they didn't, because memory runs deeper than laws. And love for a place doesn't die just because someone draws a line on a map and says, "This is mine now." In kitchens lit by oil lamps, grandmothers taught granddaughters how to braid sweetgrass, not just as craft but as prayer. Each twist held a story, each strand a name. In backyards far from the eyes of officials, men carved drums from hollowed logs and sang songs that hadn't been heard in public for decades. Not for show, not for tourists, but because the songs kept their hearts steady. And slowly, quietly, the truth began to return, not with a shout, but with a whisper that grew louder over time. People started asking questions. Young ones, raised on the stories of settlers and heroes, began to wonder, what about the others? What happened to the people who were here first? They dug through old papers, listened to elders who'd stayed silent for years, and found pieces of a story that had been buried but never destroyed. They learned that their ancestors weren't vanquished. They weren't disappeared. They survived. Not by luck, but by choice, by courage, by refusing to let go, even when everything around them said to give up. And that changed everything. Today, in towns and cities across the same land, you can find people teaching their children the old language again. You can see corn planted in the traditional way, not for show, but because it tastes better, grows stronger, and honors the earth. You can hear drums at gatherings, not as performance, but as heartbeat. The same heartbeat that kept going through famine, through war, through silence. The strangers once thought they were the only ones who could endure hardship, that their ability to push through pain, to fight, to claim, made them superior. They called themselves survivors of a hard world, and in their eyes that gave them the right to take what they wanted. But they never understood the other kind of strength, the kind that doesn't take, but protects. The kind that doesn't shout, but endures. The kind that doesn't erase, but remembers. In the end, both sides were shaped by hard worlds. Both carried scars, but only one side tried to wipe the other from the story completely. And only one side refused to be erased. Now, centuries later, the land still holds both truths. The highways run where deer trails once wound. The cities rise where council fires once burned. But if you walk softly, listen closely, you can still feel it. The presence of those who never left. Not in monuments or museums, but in the way the wind moves through the trees, in the taste of wild strawberries in June, in the quiet pride of a young person saying their people's name out loud for the first time. This isn't a story with a neat ending. There's no final battle, no grand victory parade. Healing doesn't work that way. But there is something powerful in the simple act of continuing, of waking up each day and choosing to remember, to teach, to live as if your ancestors' sacrifices mattered, and they do. Because every time a child learns a word in the old language, every time a family returns to a sacred site, every time someone stands up and says, "We are still here," the story keeps going. Not as a relic of the past, but as a living, breathing part of the present. The strangers came thinking they knew who they were dealing with. They saw people who shared food, who lived close to the earth, who didn't build stone castles or carry flags, and assumed they were weak. They didn't realize that true strength isn't in how much you can conquer, but in how much you can protect without losing your soul. They didn't know they were facing Deathworlders too. Not in the way they imagined, with guns and fire, but with something far more enduring, love for a home that would not be forgotten. And that, more than anything, is what kept the flame alive. So the next time you walk through a forest, stand by a river, or watch the sunset over open land, remember this: you're not just seeing nature. You're standing in a place that has been loved, defended, and remembered for longer than most nations have existed. And somewhere not far away, someone is still keeping that love alive. One seed, one song, one story at a time.